Grazie mille, Daniele. So apologies first for there's no paper yet. So what I thought I would do, and Daniele asked me to be part of this, was put together various things from various Brexit-related papers and topics, bits of pieces of research that I've been working on that kind of fit together. And I'll give you an overview of how I think they fit together. And it's around this theme of differentiation. So I'm going to look at the following 5 things very briefly. External differentiation, and try and make the argument it's not one-dimensional. It's a multi-dimensional choice set of the type of relationship a country has with the EU. I'll then say a little bit about what I think the Brexit bargain or Brexit deal is and why it is what it is. I'll then show you some stuff about from a survey, a conjoint experiment we did with voters in the UK about their medium-term choices, which I think reinforces the idea of it being multidimensional. And then I'll talk a bit about how economics and politics are changing very fast in the UK right now, which could suggest we could be moving towards a potential new equilibrium in this relationship. And finally, I'll say a little bit about contagion, which is I'll talk more about what some other people have done on that topic and why I think it's receding as a concern from the EU's point of view. So we all know the famous Barnier staircase. This was an attempt by the Commission to frame the Brexit negotiation as a one-dimensional space, i.e., one end is soft and the other end is hard, and by virtue of making choices, you move down this unidimensional staircase until you get to the bottom. And the UK ends up if by virtue of the red lines or the choices the UK has made, the UK ends up with a Canada-type free trade agreement. Notice there's the Korean flag on there. In fact, in some ways, the UK deal is closer to a Korean agreement than a Canadian one. But from a British point of view, for obviously racist reasons, a Canadian deal sounds nicer than a South Korean deal. That's a little summary from, I think, Centre for European Reform of what's actually in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a basic FTA, a basic free trade agreement, the kind of South Korea type or kind of Canada type free trade agreement, with a few bells and whistles attached. And they essentially commit the UK to a little bit more regulatory alignment than, and currently the regulatory alignment issue is not an issue because the UK is not yet diverged from the EU in any major way in terms of its regulatory architecture. If it does decide to do that, then the terms of the trade agreement will start to kick in, and it will be really, there will be tariffs and quotas that will start to be introduced. I should add at this point, Brexit was not what did Churchill say? The end, it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning. Right, well, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was the end of the beginning. It's the end of the beginning of the Brexit process. Brexit is continuous. The actual timetable in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, almost every 6 months from when the deal was agreed and the UK left, right through for the next sort of 10 years, there's timetabled bits and pieces of the implementation of the deal, and it will gradually get harder. The deal gradually hardens. The quotas and the tariffs and the regulatory alignment rules get stricter and harder as the UK goes along. And we're already starting to feel that biting in Northern Ireland. And why then the Northern Ireland Protocol starts to become an issue because of the extra requirements the EU is imposing on the UK as part of the Brexit deal to enforce regulatory checks in particular. So again, if you think of it as this one dimension, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is pretty close to the basic FTA or a Canada type deal. In the negotiation process, there were other options being discussed along that continuum, the closest being the EEA. EEA minus was essentially Norway minus the free movement of people, which some people in the UK were discussing, or a Canada plus, or as Boris Johnson called it, a Canada plus plus plus, which essentially was Canada plus some kind of extra services deal. Bear in mind that the UK economy is a services economy. It's not a goods-based economy. In addition to finance and business services, which is the largest sector of the British economy, the second largest sector is film, fashion, art, design, and media, i.e. creative industries. In a paper as part of the INDEV project, which was a project run out of the EUI and I was part of a team with these other folks here, we were looking at external differentiation for a series of states that the EU has relationships with. And we really carefully logged what the details were of that relationship across a range of different areas. And this is summarized for about half of all the areas we looked at. But what I think this summary tells us is it suggests it's not one-dimensional. If it was one-dimensional, if you were closer in one area, you would have to be closer in all the other areas as well. But that's not actually the case, as you can see. So, for example, Turkey has a customs agreement, but the other states don't. And you can see how across the different areas, in these areas down here on political and legal dimension, it looks more or less one-dimensional, but it's not. So again, Turkey has more of a say than the UK does in terms of its participation in agencies, for example. The UK is really very hard or external. Gradually, they might build back, and that's what I think is what is going to be the terms of the relationship. But I think this suggests it's more or less one-dimensional, but not always. And there's quite a lot of movement below the surface you can do in terms of being softer or harder or closer or further away as a result, without it undermining the basic architecture of where you are. The EU does not want the UK to be another Switzerland. It would much rather the UK had a off-the-shelf either basic FTA or the EEA. And this is where I came to actually with a paper that I wrote in the middle of the Brexit negotiations when I was trying to work out where we were going to be heading, and me and many other people were saying, because of the red lines on both sides, we were going to end up with a basic FTA, and we did end up with a basic FTA. So this was a very simple 2-by-2 game where the numbers here are the rank order of the choices. The blue is the EU and the red is the UK. The UK wanted this FTA+++ idea, have its cake and eat it. The second choice was a basic FTA. Third choice was EEA minus, and fourth choice was this EEA deal, i.e. what in UK was being called fax democracy or Puerto Rico of the EU. The EU wanted an EEA off the shelf, i.e. UK has to do as everything we tell them and they have no say in the participation of it. Second choice was an off the shelf basic FTA. And if you think of it, for both sides, the basic FTA was the equilibrium outcome, although suboptimal from either side in terms of overall economic consequences of the model. And I'll return to this. But what this suggests, I think, is that basic FTA is going to be very, very difficult to shift. It is the result of a bargaining equilibrium because of the red lines on both sides. And the red lines on both sides have not shifted significantly. They certainly haven't shifted from the EU side. The EU's main red line was no cherry picking, meaning you can't have free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, but not free movement of labor, which is what essentially the UK wanted. And even when it wanted free movement of services, it wanted completely mutual recognition. And there were British politicians going around saying, why can't we have mutual recognition for everything? We had to explain to them, the EU doesn't even have internal mutual recognition for services. Why would they give it to the UK externally? And they couldn't get their head around that. It's just how low the quality of the debate was in the UK. But after the Brexit process, we then thought, well, before actually Brexit kicks in, the Brexit deal has been done. The Brexit deal is going to enter into force. What actually is the UK thinking in terms of, our British citizens thinking in terms of their medium-term relationship with the EU? What would they like out of this? There have been a lot of surveys in the field, YouGov and Ipsos Mori and so on, where they ask people, do you want to be a member of the single market? Do you want the UK to apply EU regulatory standards? Do you want to end the free movement of people? And of course, if you ask people that, it's like saying, do you want the state to spend more money on healthcare and do you want to cut taxes? And everyone says yes to both. So you can't ask people those types of questions. You have to, unfortunately, ask them trade-off questions. But one way to ask them a set of trade-offs is with the conjoint. So you give them packages of options and you force them to make choices across these options. So that's what we did. So we kept it simple. You can really make complicated conjoints and still get some leverage. But the reason why we wanted to keep it simple is because we were interested in the overall ranking of the possible packages of all these combinations. So for each, we just gave a harder and a softer option for just 4 dimensions. So market access, so either full market access or very little market access. full regulatory alignment or complete sovereignty for the UK, end to the free movement of people, but except for high-skilled workers versus complete end to the free movement of people. And we could have nuanced that a bit more than we did in hindsight. UK makes payments into the budget. UK doesn't make any payments into the budget. And then, of course, we randomized in a conjoint survey design. I'll show you the marginal means first for the Leave versus Remain voters, and then I'll show you the package ranking across them. And what's interesting in general is, so blue here are the Remain voters and red are the Leave voters. And you can see how they agree on most things. So they agree in terms of they're both, if you include end of free movement of people between the EU and the UK, except for high-skilled workers. Interestingly, even Leave voters preferred that to the complete end of the free movement of people, which is interesting. Very few restrictions on, so both Leave and Remain voters want complete open access to the market in terms of free movement of goods. Very different views on whether the UK should align with the EU's regulatory standards. So you can see how Remain voters were in favour of aligning with regulatory standards. Leave voters were in favour of the UK having much more regulatory sovereignty. And this is the trade-off that's going to be very difficult to reconcile in any future movement. The EU is not going to give the UK more market access unless the UK agrees to continue with regulatory alignment. And that's ultimately the battle the EU has with Switzerland, and it's the battle the EU will have with the UK, and particularly around dynamic regulatory alignment, which is the problem of the Swiss agreement, which perhaps we can get into in Q&A. But in terms of if you only got 4 packages and 2 options for each of the packages, you can actually rank order them, looking at which is the most popular. So this is the percentage of times a package is chosen compared to all other packages, if that package is given as an option. Green means it's soft, orange means it's hard, and that's the softest of all type of arrangements, which was the most popular amongst Remain voters, was to have a very, very soft type of Brexit. Down here, I've got what is sort of politically viable from an EU point of view. So the kind of have your cake and eat it, which is the kind of, we get full regulatory sovereignty and full market access, of course, is not viable from an EU point of view. Whereas the full soft version is viable. You can apply, or the full hard version is viable. And you can see here, this is the trade and cooperation agreement down here, and you can see how that's not particularly popular with anybody. So the actual equilibrium they ended up with is not particularly popular. The hardest of hard type Brexits is also not particularly popular, although was quite popular amongst leavers. And you can see how on average, the sort of, this is the softest version EEA type Brexit. You can see Remainers are very much in favour of this, leavers very much opposed to it, but overall is pretty popular on average. And actually we also have breakdowns for England and Scotland, and it's more popular in Scotland, even amongst Leave voters in Scotland. So that was the deal as it was done. Why we ended up with an equilibrium, which was a basic free trade agreement, and how the trade-off between market access and regulatory alignment is going to stay. Now the world has shifted. Brexit has started to kick in, and we're now actually seeing the economic effects of Brexit. And the BBC is even now allowed to talk about Brexit. Even occasionally on the Today programme in the morning or on the nightly news, they mention Brexit, which they weren't allowed to talk about for about 3 years. Now they are, with lots and lots of caveats attached whenever they mention it. And the best piece of research that sort of tries to estimate the economic effects of Brexit is a nice synthetic control estimation by John Springford at the Centre for European Reform. So synthetic controls are, there's a model of the UK economy up to the Brexit point where you look at what model predicts the performance of the UK economy, and it's something like 40% of the US and 20% of Germany and 5% of France and so on. And that predicts exactly the performance of the British economy up to the referendum. And then you say, what's the performance of that doppelganger economy versus the actual performance of the UK economy post-Brexit? And you can see how this leads to an estimation of around about 5% of UK GDP shortfall as a result of Brexit, which my former colleagues at the LSE and the former so macroeconomists are rarely right when they predict the future, because most macroeconomic models of the future are wrong. But these guys are whooping for joy now. Their one model of Brexit was predicting a 5% impact of Brexit on the British economy, and it looks like they're more or less right. So this is, and the other big effect, of course, is this like almost 14% shortfall in UK goods trade export. So you can see how, and there's a new paper from the Centre for Economic Performance at LSE, which looks at the effect of Brexit on prices. We've seen massive price inflation in the UK. The British Conservative government is going to cap food prices in the UK. Who'd have thought? You know, socialism in Britain introduced by Tories. But you can see how, you know, and they reckon that something like 20% of that increase in prices is as a result of Brexit. So Brexit is really starting to kick in. And the public have noticed. So this is the YouGov Brexit tracker, which is a nice tracker because I think it's a nice question, but also they ask it every week. So it's a beautiful time series. And the question is, in hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? And you can see how initially, immediately after the vote, people were saying the UK was right, and then gradually it shifts downwards, and then COVID hits, and for a while the UK looks like it's doing better with COVID, and then of course the economic effects start to kick in post-COVID. And right now you can see how this is even with don't knows included here. They're included but not shown. You can see how 55% are saying that they think the UK was wrong to vote to leave the EU. New polls are also showing that actually a clear majority are in favour of a softer form of Brexit. It's not that there's a majority in favour of rejoining. I don't think we'd rejoin. And we could perhaps talk about Labour and its response. We're going to have elections at some point next year, probably in the spring for a variety of reasons. If Labour wins those elections, I think we will start to see a shift, even though rhetorically in going into the election, they're saying they're accepting the Brexit status quo. In pretty much all dimensions, including the movement of people and everything else. But underlying this graph, so Juho, my colleague here at SPS, is a top demographer, is a social demographer, and he immediately said, Simon, how much of this is demographic change? Because there was a steep age gradient in the vote. And I said, that's a good question, I don't know. So we got the data from YouGov, and to try and estimate how much of that switch, that big switch between right and wrong is purely driven by demographic change. Because when you have a very steep age gradient in the vote, so older people far more likely to vote for Brexit, younger people far less likely to vote for Brexit, the old people are dying off and more young people are entering the electorate. So this is then the YouGov, that same YouGov survey question. This is Brexit was wrong, this is Brexit was right, and this is by age cohort. So you can see how these are the oldest here. The oldest two cohorts hardly changed their mind in Brexit wrong. Brexit was wrong and Brexit was right. They've hardly changed their mind. Almost everyone else, so this is the average effect that I showed you in the previous graph. So wrong has gone up, right has gone down. You can see amongst the oldest cohort, they haven't really changed their mind. Amongst the youngest cohorts, they have, and they've swung very much against Brexit. So you're getting a double effect. Amongst the oldest cohort that are dying out, they've not changed their mind. We estimate that almost a third of that switch is purely demographics. And it raises interesting questions about legitimacy of referendums if you've got a very steep age gradient in a referendum, because very quickly it starts to become illegitimate as the old people die out and the young people start to join the electorate. But you're getting the double effect of young people joining the electorate who are anti-Brexit, but also amongst those younger cohorts, they're also switching their views very strongly against Brexit. So things are really starting to shift fast. And I think this is raising questions about how stable that Brexit equilibrium is from the UK's point of view. And then that leads me to a final set of thoughts when thinking about contagion, because why did the EU play such hardball with the UK? And I think the Barnier staircase, the red lines, the no cherry picking, I think it really was driven by a potential fear of contagion. If there's a special deal for the UK, wouldn't others say, wait a minute, I really like that kind of deal? And I remember talking to people in the Commission, and they were very worried about Hungary, and they were worried about Austria, and they were worried, even potentially someone said, I'm worried about Sweden, because Sweden then, once the UK leaves, Sweden now is the largest economy in the EU that's not in the Eurozone. And of course, Sweden has close connections to the UK and close connections to Norway, both economically and culturally. Sweden used to be in EFTA. Is Sweden next was the kind of question. And there were some interesting blog pieces written at the time. And I'm going to show you some data from public opinion from Sweden compared to the other member states. But there was a really nice paper from Stephanie Walter in CPS in 2021, which looks at the effect of Brexit over time in a survey. She did 6 surveys through 27 EU member states over 6 waves between 2017 and 2020. And she shows how 2 types of questions. 1% stating that in 5 years, Brexit will make the UK better off. You can see how that declined over time as people realized the Brexit hit on the British economy was growing, and how difficult the Brexit process was, and what a disaster it was for UK politics. And even internally, the support for leaving the EU also fell over time during the Brexit negotiation process. And what's interesting, also studying populist parties. So if you look at the radical right in the Netherlands or in France or here in Italy, the whole idea of Frexit or Nexit or Italexit has disappeared. None of them are in favor of their country leaving anymore. None of them are in favor of their country even leaving the euro anymore. They all have switched to say, we're in favor of a different sort of EU, a looser kind of EU, or a more decentralized EU. None of them are in favor of actually saying we want to copy the UK. So in that sense, the threat, at least now, the threat of contagion, I think, has really declined. Another way to look at that is with the broader Eurobarometer public opinion data. So that's from 2014 to the present. So you can sort of look at parallel trends up to 2016. 2016, of course, is the Brexit referendum. It's also the refugee crisis. So it's difficult to differentiate between the two. And then this is Brexit actually happens. But of course, COVID hits just around the same time. So again, it's difficult to differentiate between the two. But you can see how this is the average, this is the EU membership question. Do you think your membership of the EU is a good thing, a bad thing, or don't know? And this is the percentage of support who say good thing minus the percentage who say bad thing. That's the overall trend of the EU 27, which has been remarkably stable actually from 2014 to 2022 when you think about what has happened over that period. It's been remarkably static. It's not been the case for the new member states where you saw a big decline after the refugee crisis. Picks up again a little bit with COVID, falls again, and is back up again. But I mean, it's relatively stable from around about this period after the refugee crisis. Sweden here, the state that people were worried about, where there potentially would be contagion, has had the opposite effect. Sweden is now reaching kind of, I don't know what the cause of it might be, but Sweden is now very pro-EU, and it could well be in response to looking at what a disaster Brexit was. Oh my God, we didn't realize actually what we benefit from the EU. You need to kind of test that at a micro level, but I think there's definitely something going on here where Sweden, in response to Brexit or response to everything that's happened over the last 5 or 6 years, is much more pro-EU than it was. But we had a little window of what would happen if Brexit did work. And we had a little window of this during the vaccine rollout. You recall back to early 2021, when the UK went for central purchasing of vaccines. And you know, this was just, if you can get it from the world in our data and just shrink it down to that period, you can see how this was the total COVID vaccine doses administered per 100. The UK was streaming ahead. Now, had it been the US streaming ahead and the UK hadn't been, they'd have gone, well, the US just does things differently, we'll get there. But because it was the UK and it was just after Brexit, this was hugely politically explosive on the continent. And you had German politicians calling for Ursula von der Leyen to be sacked. You had calling for her to resign, and you had people saying Brexit wasn't meant to work. How is this happening? I mean, of course, the EU caught up. But this was a window, I think, on the potential consequences of the UK, of it, Brexit being conceived or perceived to have worked at any point. And at some point in the future, the UK, I mean, I do think Britain will figure it out eventually. And we'll figure out, there will be a point where the business cycles go in different directions, and where it looks like the UK is booming and it looks like the continent is not. And people, the danger for the EU then at that point is the perception will be that Brexit has worked. And that will be dangerous, I think, for EU politics at that point. So pulling all these different bits and pieces together from various pieces of research and other thoughts I've been having over the last couple of years, I think external differentiation, it's neither one-dimensional nor fully multidimensional. It's a sort of one-dimensional plus. In a sense, there's different models of a relationship with the EU. We now have, in addition to the Norwegian model, in addition to the Swiss model, in addition to the Canadian/South Korean model, we now have a UK model. The UK model is a moving target. And if the UK model at any point seems to be working, then this becomes something that some countries could think they could take off the shelf, and that's the worry. And the UK model is somewhere on that continuum, but there's still potential movement within it in terms of the UK getting closer. The Brexit deal was a relatively hard free trade agreement, but that package was pretty unpopular. It was a result of a sort of suboptimal outcome, if you like. It wasn't driven, the Brexit bargain was not driven by economics, it was driven by politics on both sides. And if economics had been front and center, they would have signed a much softer EEA type deal, which would have had less of an economic impact for the UK for sure. The impact of Brexit on the EU economy is a rounding error, so it doesn't really matter for the rest of the EU. From the UK's perspective, the economic effects are really starting to bite, and public opinion is really shifting and shifting really fast. And part of that is driven by demographic change. So I think we will start to see a debate, at least in the UK, of what do we replace the trade and cooperation agreement with? There will be a lot of cake thinking, kind of have my cake and eat it. Can we have full access to the single market without there being regulatory alignment? Can we have a special services deal to give the City of London access to the single market? Can we have no checks on goods, which would mean, you know, just accepting the EU's regulatory standards via some kind of mutual recognition, i.e. the UK being a virtual member of the single market, even though it's not. And I think the EU's response will be a predictable response, which is no effing way. UK, you know, you can want those things. That doesn't mean you're going to get them. And I think the EU is unlikely to give the UK better market access without the UK signing up to full regulatory alignment and that being enforced by the ECJ, which is going to be politically very, very hard. That said, there are various bits underneath that broad picture where the UK will start to move. And I think common phytosanitary standards, which you might say is a bit techie, but actually is really important when it comes for most of what is really stopping the checks, the border checks that are increasing prices in supermarkets in the UK. It's phytosanitary standards and some kind of agreement that says we'll agree to apply the EU. Who cares in Britain whether nobody in Britain cares whether we have sovereignty or not in phytosanitary standards, but they do care about prices in supermarkets. So it's a pretty easy sell. Market access for particular services sectors, it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all deal. You can have different access for different sectors, whether it's, you know, the film industry. I mean, I'll give you an anecdote. Vivendi Universal is the world's largest film production company. It's an American-French company. Its European headquarters were based in South Kensington in London. Its European headquarters are now based in Paris. They've moved almost everybody from their London office to their Paris office. And a former student of mine was telling me the story about this. And she was saying that the reason they did this is because they just didn't know whether they would be able to win those contracts if they were based in London. You know, if you win a contract to make, you know, it's like 4 or 5 years down the line to make a TV series for a German state TV company. And a German state TV company is now saying, well, we don't want to go with the Brits. We don't know what the public procurement rules are going to be. We don't know whether you're going to be able to move equipment across borders. So it's too risky for us to do a deal with a British-based company. So they've said it's just too risky for us. We just moved all of their production over to Paris. So, you know, these kind of things in the services sector would make a big difference to the British economy. There's starting to be a discussion about free movement of workers in the UK. We are desperately short of workers. Immigration figures from the UK have just gone through the roof. Net immigration of 660,000, I think it was last year. There's some particular reasons why, but that's almost double net immigration at the height of the sort of Brexit process. And then frameworks for UK-EU cooperation in defence and security. Overall, I think the threat, you know, so the UK could ask for a few things. I think from the EU side, the threat of contagion has diminished, and that might enable the EU to be a little bit more flexible towards the UK than it had done in the middle of that Brexit bargaining process.